rise up and we follow the path that we believe in. No, we're not gonna stop until we reach it. Oh, all you need to know is that we're holding on. We rise up from the dust and claim our throne. We rise up from the dust and claim our throne. We rise up from the dust and claim our throne. When you feel it's hopeless, when you think that you lost, oh, I will take your hand and we'll rise up from the dust. Oh, here we go, 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 let us heal and grow. You won't be alone, we're unstoppable. Don't be afraid to show what we're going for. This is what we know. Here we come back to life, we're still breathing. Standing up, everybody's gonna see it. Oh, all you need to know is that we're holding on. Even if we fall, we will rise up and we follow the path that we believe in. No, we're not gonna stop until we reach it. Oh, all you need to know is that we're holding on. We rise up from the dust and claim our throne. We rise up from the dust and claim our throne. We all have our reasons why we are on this track. Oh, we all have our burdens, yeah, but we just keep on fighting and we never look back. Here we go, 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 let us heal and grow. You won't be alone, we're unstoppable. Don't be afraid to show what we're going for. This is what we know. Here we come back to life, we're still breathing. Standing up, everybody's gonna see.
Good evening. Time for a couple more chapters from the Hollow Earth Enigma. So we are on chapter 3, so we'll try to do 3 and 4 tonight. They're relatively short chapters, so that's not too bad. I'll get through 2. So let's just jump right on into it here. So, chapter 3, the theory of concentric spheres. Excuse me, that AC is loud. I'm going to... All right. The theory of concentric spheres. Standing in an old park in Hamilton in southwestern Ohio is a curious, weather-beaten monument which is easy to miss in the everyday bustle of the industrial city. It is made of a 4-sided shaft almost 5 feet high and surmounted by a hollow sphere. The inscription below, worn or defaced almost to the point of illegibility, informs anyone who stops to look that it was erected in 1829 by a man with the curious name of Americus Vespucius Sims, to commemorate the life of his father, Captain John Cleves Sims. The memorial honors him not as a soldier, for the city boasts a magnificent soldiers, sailors, and pioneers monument, but far more remarkably as the first modern champion of the Hollow Earth legend. The words on the plaque are as odd as any to be found on a monument anywhere in the world. And we have a copy here. Captain John Cleves Sims, soldier, philosopher, and the originator of Sims' theory of concentric spheres and polar voids. He contended the earth was hollow and habitable within. Quote unquote. Sadly, little is known by most people in Hamilton about Sims' life, or his theory. Those who do acknowledge the captain tend to regard him as an eccentric who wore himself out vainly touring the country, lecturing people on his crackpot theories and trying to win support for an expedition to the inner world. Yet what Sims did, following a distinguished career as a soldier, was to devote himself with single-minded determination to explaining what he believed to be the answer to the age-old question of the hollow earth. Excuse me. The city of Hamilton lies on the Great Miami River, about 25 miles north of Cincinnati, and manufactures textiles, paper, automobile parts, safes, and mechanical and hydraulic presses. Despite being the seat of local government, it could never be described as a tourist attraction, although it does have a rather curious history. The first building here was Fort Hamilton, which was used between 1791 and 1796 by General Mad Anthony Wayne as his base for fighting the Indians. In 1794, a town called Fairfield was built alongside the fort, and this was later renamed after Alexander Hamilton, the American statesman. With the construction in the mid 1850s of the Miami and Erie Canal, providing connections to Cincinnati in the south and Dayton to the north, its future as a center was assured. The early settlers in this part of Ohio probably had other things on their minds than the investigation of the enormous mounds to be seen all over the area, which, according to legend, had been there since ancient times. Certainly those who farmed the land with more practical considerations to worry about leveled many of them to the ground before any archaeologists had a chance to carry out research. It is no part of our history to speculate on the actual origins of the mounds. But it is no part of our, yeah, that's an odd sentence. It is no part of our history to speculate on the actual origins of the mounds. But Robert Choureau has one fascinating theory to offer in his book, The Mysterious Unknown, 1972. Quote, in North America, and especially in Ohio, mounds and enormous serpentines are found which were built of earth before the dawn of even prehistoric times. There is no doubt that in the olden days they existed in their thousands, which might make one wonder if the real land of the hills of our Celtic ancestors was perhaps not in Mexico but in North America, at least in the very earliest times. Later on, perhaps the land of the hills may have been in Mexico when the first earthen tumuli were raised. Whatever the truth may be, the number of artificial mounds in the USA is legion. At Chillicothe, I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that right, Chillicothe, Ohio, not far from Hamilton, there are 24 of them, conical in shape. End quote. All this seems to make Hamilton, Ohio, a very appropriate spot to be associated with the career of John Cleves Sims, advocate of the theory of concentric spheres. Although he was not actually born there, but in Sussex County, New Jersey, on 5 November 1780, and was baptized after a famous uncle of the same name who played a significant role in the history of the Midwest, devising the Sims Purchase. His predecessors also included a distinguished line of New England clergymen, the earliest being Zachariah Sims, an English Puritan who had emigrated to Massachusetts from East Anglia in 1634. At school, young John proved adept at mathematics and science and was also an omnivorous reader. As the family library contained a number of the works of Cotton Mather, who had been a friend and fellow clergyman of Zachariah Sims, it is believed that he first discovered the theory of the hollow earth in the pages of the Christian philosopher. However, at the age of 20, Sims chose the army as his career and quickly proved himself a capable and efficient soldier. By the year 1812, when the war between America and Great Britain had broken out, he had risen to the rank of captain. He took part in the battles of Bridgewater and Lundy's Lane and was mentioned for bravery. In 1813, he played an important role in Oliver Hazard Perry's victory at the Battle of Lake Erie when he led a band of commandos against the British defenses, leaving them vulnerable to Perry's main onslaught. The captain received several medals for bravery and became something of a hero. Unfortunately, however, his highly individual style of soldiering, which had nevertheless helped to make his surprise attack so successful, coupled with his sharp tongue, directed at both his men and his superiors, did not endear him to those in command. After the final decisive victory by Andrew Jackson at New Orleans in January 1815, Sims found himself assigned to a backwoods fort on the upper Mississippi River. Although he must have been frustrated at this posting, Sims decided to make use of his time by developing his interest in how the earth had been formed. Inspired all those years before by Cotton Mather's essay, his reading led him to the theories of two American professors, Abner Burnett and John Woodward. Burnett maintained that the Earth had started its existence as a floating mud ball covered with oil and picked up space rubbish to form its outer crust, while Woodward suggested the planet was made of distinct layers of different strata that had been laid one upon another, quote, like the layers of an onion, end quote. John Cleves Sims, however, came to his own conclusion that the Earth was hollow with 5 concentric spheres inside the outer surface, all with a common center. Apart from reading scientific works, Sims had also noticed that in nature many things were hollow, from the reeds growing along the Mississippi River bank to the bones in the meat served at dinner. More controversially, he came to the conclusion that Newton's theory of gravity was wrong. Instead, he decided the atmosphere was filled with an invisible substance which he named aerial elastic fluid, composed of tiny spheres of ether which were also hollow. It was this invisible substance that pushed down against the earth rather than Newton's theory of a pulling process, he maintained. The whole concept gradually became an obsession with Sims, and in 1816 he resigned his commission to put his theories to the American public. In order to fund his research, he moved to St. Louis, Missouri, and set up a trading post where he supplied the military, traded with the Indians, and still found time to work on his project. He also married a widow, Mary Ann Lockwood, who already had 6 children, and promptly fathered 4 more, all of whom were given names similar to the firstborn Americus Vespucius Sims. One day, while sitting by the Missouri, another thought occurred to Sims. If there were entrances to this hollow world, the most likely place for them must surely be the North and South Poles. But how to get there and find out? He knew it was imperative to seek the support of government and scientific circles, and so he decided to issue a statement. This would go to the U.S. President, to Congress, the major American universities, the heads of state, and leading scientists in Europe, as well as to every major town and city in the country. An example of this unique document, which ensured Sims's notoriety, dated 10 April 1818, still survives in the Library of Congress in Washington, from which I made the following copy. And he has the whole letter here. Quote, circular, to all the world. Light gives light to light discover ad infinitum. St. Louis, Missouri Territory, North America, April 10, 1818. I declare that the earth is hollow, habitable within, containing a number of solid concentric spheres, one within the other, and it is open at the poles 12 or 16 degrees. I pledge my life in support of this truth, and am ready to explore the hollow if the world will support and aid me in the undertaking. John Cleves Sims of Ohio, late captain of infantry. End quote. Oh, no, not even close. Um, NB. So there's a whole bunch more of it. NB. I have I have ready for the press a treatise in the Principles of Matter, wherein I show proofs of the above proposition, account for various phenomena, and disclose Dr. Darwin's golden secret. My terms are the patronage of this and the New World. I dedicate to my wife and her 10 children. I select Dr. S. L. Mitchell, Sir H. Davy, and Baron Alexander von Humboldt as my protectors. I ask 100 brave companions, well equipped, to start from Siberia in the fall season with reindeer and sledges on the ice of the frozen sea. I engage we will find a warm and rich land stocked with thrifty vegetables and animals, if not men, on reaching 1 degree northward of latitude 82. We will return in the succeeding spring. JCS. End quote. Attached to the circular is a note to the effect that the document was accompanied by another letter signed by several prominent citizens of St. Louis, testifying that the author was a good father, a respectable businessman, and a Christian gentleman. However, all that the missive elicited from its recipients was a bemused silence, although, according to some U.S. sources, the Tsar of Russia was said to have been intrigued by the idea of new lands to conquer. In Paris, at the Académie des Sciences, the Comte de Volney dismissed the writer as a madman. Undeterred, Sims wrote a number of newspaper articles about his theory and decided to give lectures at which he would appeal for donations to fund the expedition. A young man, Paul Clark, who was present at one of the captain's lectures to the faculty and students of Union College in the winter of 1826 and 27, took copious notes and later wrote an invaluable article, The Sims Theory of the Earth, which appeared in the Atlantic Monthly of April 1873. In this he writes, quote, very long quote, 4 paragraphs. Quote, according to this theory, the Earth is globular, hollow, and open at the poles. The diameter of the northern opening is about 2,000 miles, of 4,000 miles from outside to outside. The southern opening is somewhat larger. The planes of these openings are parallel to each other, but from an angle of 12 degrees with the equator, so that the highest part of the North Pole is directly opposite the lowest part of the South Pole. The shell of the Earth is about 1,000 miles thick, and the edges of this shell at the opening are called verges, and measure from the regular concavity within to the regular convexity without, about 1,500 miles. The verges occupy about 25 degrees, and if delineated on a map would show only the outer half of the verge, while all above or farther from the equator, both north and south, would lie on the apex and within the verge. All the polar regions upon the present map would be out of sight. The meridian lines extend at right angles from the equator to the outer edges of the verges, and then wind round along the surface of the verges, terminating at the points directly under the highest parts of the verges, both north and south. The line which marks the location of the apex of the northern verge begins at a point in Lapland about 68 degrees north and 20 degrees east from London on a meridian traversing Spitzbergen, whence it passes southwest across the Atlantic Ocean and the southern part of Greenland, through Hudson Bay and over the continent to the Pacific near Cook's Inlet, thence across the Fox Islands to a point about 56 degrees north and 160 degrees west, nearly south of the Bering Straits. Then it passes over the Pacific, crossing the south part of Kamchatka, continuing northwest through Siberia, entering Europe across the Ural Mountains in latitude about 58 degrees north, and passing near the Arctic coast over the mouth of the White Sea to the point of starting. Captain Sims collated with great labor many isolated facts from his own researches and from the accounts of Ross, Howe, Perry, Mackenzie, and others who had by land and sea explored the polar regions, while similar proofs have been drawn from later explorations since the promulgation of the theory in 1829. The explorers who furnished facts for the support of this theory seem, none of them, to have had the remotest conjecture of it. The facts are admitted, and it cannot be urged against the author that he has marshaled in its support fictitious premises. End quote. As part of his argument, says Clark, Sims cited the remarkable differences in climate experiences at the poles, the vast open areas of ocean that exist there, phenomena like the aurora borealis, which could only be explained by light coming through polar openings, the erratic behavior of magnetic needles, and finally the rings of Saturn as proof of the theory of concentricity in nature. The captain had amassed an impressive collection of facts and arguments to support his theory. His attentive listener concluded, and, quote, only time the great revealer of secrets will determine whether this startling theory is true in whole or in part, and whether its author was a visionary or a profound philosopher whose name will be honored among men, end quote. Despite the sympathetic hearing John Cleves Sims received on this occasion, he was often greeted with derision and sometimes even had to physically eject some of the more vigorous hecklers. His rather jingoistic claim that the discovery of the hollow earth would bring acclaim to America along with new territories did, however, find a response from audiences in some of the smaller communities of the nation. His appeals for support also caught the attention of a wealthy businessman, James McBride of Miami in Ohio, who was a trustee of the local university and a man with friends in high places. He helped the former soldier with financial aid to settle in nearby Hamilton, and there introduced him to the aptly named Richard Mentor Johnson, the representative of the adjoining state of Kentucky. Johnson proved to be an open-minded, intelligent politician who, although not altogether convinced by Sims's theory, felt it at least deserved an airing in Washington. Consequently, on 28 January 1823, Johnson proposed in Congress that, quote, the U.S. government finance an expedition to claim the lands inside the earth, end quote. He outlined Sims's theory and his plans and held up a huge sheaf of letters which he claimed had come from people in Ohio, Kentucky, Indiana, and Missouri. Quote, they are all from sane, intelligent voters demanding that we bring great honor and profit to the United States by opening up these new lands, end quote, he declared. Sadly, very few of the other representatives shared Johnson's enthusiasm for the proposal, and it was shelved. For Sims, it meant looking elsewhere to raise the necessary funds, while for Johnson, the moment would soon become no more than just a bizarre incident in a career which would culminate in his being elected vice president. Nevertheless, thanks to the continued support of James McBride, Sims was able to go on with his punishing tour of lectures, which kept him away from his wife and family in Hamilton for months on end as he crisscrossed the country. In March 1824, he was encouraged by a benefit performance at the Cincinnati Theater in aid of his proposed expedition, and this was followed 2 months later by the most successful of all his lectures, in Hamilton no less. At the end of it, the audience passed a resolution, quote, that we esteem Sims's theory of the earth deserving of serious attention and worthy of the attention of the American people, end quote. McBride saw to the collecting of all Sims notes and articles and published them in 1826 as Sims's Theory of Concentric Spheres. The wealthy philanthropist also included an illustration of Sims's terrestrial globe and a foreword to the book in which he reaffirmed his belief. Quote, although the particular location of the places where the verges of the polar openings are believed to exist may not have been ascertained with absolute certainty, yet they are believed to be nearly correct. Their localities have been ascertained from appearances that exist in these regions, such as a belt of or zone surrounding the globe where trees and other vegetation, except moss, do not grow, the tides of the ocean flowing in different directions and appearing to meet, the ground swells in the sea being more frequent, and the aurora borealis appearing to the southward. End quote. And that is actually the end of. Oh, no, it's not. Why is there such a big break? I thought that was the end of the chapter already. It's not. There's just a picture. Okay. So it is Sims's terrestrial globe as represented on the back cover of the 1885 edition of his book, The Sims Theory of Concentric Spheres. So let me go ahead and pull that up here for you. There we have it. So he did say 5 layers, so I only see 4 illustrated there, but close enough. Um, at least that's what I think. That's how you would read that. Unless you read the dark parts. I was reading the lighter stripes here. But if you count the outer surface, then the black areas, 2, 3, 4, 5. I don't know. I don't know if that's how it's supposed to be. But I'm pretty sure he said 5 spheres. Anyway, back to the reading. Further petitions for financial aid on Sims's behalf were sent to Congress and the General Assembly of Ohio, though with a continued lack of success. In 1825, the captain was granted permission to join a Russian polar expedition, but was unable to accept due to his impoverished financial condition and declining health. The strain on his constitution of the strenuous lecture tours finally led to his collapse in the winter of 1828 while he was traveling in Canada. The ever faithful McBride arranged for him to be transported home to Hamilton, and there he was lovingly cared for by his long-suffering wife. But his obsession with the hollow earth ultimately cost John Cleves Sims his life, and he died in his sleep on 29 May 1829. He was buried with full military honors, and his obituary in the Hamilton Eagle spoke more admiringly of his army career than of his theory of concentric globes. But Sims's theory did not die with him. One of his followers, Joseph Reynolds, a graduate of Ohio University, who had been attracted to the captain after hearing one of his lectures and became his manager responsible for setting up his lectures, decided to carry on trying to raise money for the Hollow Earth expedition. The speeches which he delivered were rather more colorful than those of his mentor, promising a subterranean world flooded with warm light, pleasant cities, and, for good measure, a race of 20-foot giants who guarded a priceless treasure. Invitations that Reynolds extended to join the expedition nonetheless raised hundreds of dollars from the public. Reynolds's greatest triumph was to convince the U.S. Secretary of the Navy, Samuel Lewis Southard, of the viability of the plan. Southard anyway, in turn, appears to have convinced no less a person than the President, John Quincy Adams, that the theory was worth investigating, and there is evidence that the President asked for a feasibility study to be made for sending a Navy ship to the South Pole. Before this order could be implemented, however, Adams' term of office came to an end, and his successor, the no-nonsense former U.S. commander and hero of the War of 1812, Andrew Jackson, 1767 to 1845, scuppered the proposal. Joseph Reynolds tried one more scheme. In 1829, he set up the Hollow Earth Exploration Company and issued stock certificates on the New York Stock Exchange. There was, it seemed, something about the idea which appealed to the more adventurous and wealthy people in the city, and with rumors of the fortunes that might be made by finding the subterranean world, Reynolds and his associates raised enough cash to commission 2 vessels to sail to the South Pole. Both were brigantines, the Anawan, commanded by Captain N.B. Palmer, and the Seraph, skippered by Captain Robert Pendleton. They sailed from New York Harbor on 29 October 1829. There is, however, some doubt as to whether Joseph Reynolds actually left on this expedition, although documents show the presence on the Seraph of a scientist named J. Reynolds, accompanied by one Dr. Watson. Equally uncertain is what happened to the 2 ships. One story maintains that the brigs got no nearer their goal than the coast of Chile before the crews mutinied. Another says the expedition was shipwrecked, while a third has it that they did reach the South Pole, but that there a group of seamen put ashore on the ice cap soon got lost and were only rescued just in time to prevent them dying of cold and starvation. What is beyond doubt is that the ill-fated expedition did not find a polar opening, and Joseph Reynolds was never heard of again. It was a tragedy that Sims's undoubtedly serious intentions should have ended in such a tawdry fashion, but just as his memorial in Hamilton has survived the passage of time, so his idea has continued to inspire others. In the world of literature, too, this theory has generated a veritable library of novels and stories that for a century and a half have intrigued and delighted readers, most of whom probably know little or nothing of their source of inspiration. Fellow American Edgar Allan Poe virtually invented this school of fiction in his short story MS Found in a Bottle, or Message Found in a Bottle, I believe is the full thing. 1833, followed by the novel The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym, 1838, which was unfinished at his death and later completed by Jules Verne, who entitled the work An Antarctic Mystery, 1898. Verne had earlier written probably the best-known book on the theme, Journey to the Center of the Earth, 1872, about a group of explorers who venture into a hollow earth through the core of a dormant volcano. In 1959, it was intelligently scripted and filmed, starring James Mason as the party leader. The spirit of Sims is also to be found in William R. Bradshaw's The Goddess of Atvatabar, being the history of the discovery of the interior worlds and conquest of Atvatabar, 1892. Which was published complete with a map of the interior world, quote unquote, clearly based on the captain's own design. This hollow earth, however, is peopled by a love cult whose devotees regard sex without orgasm as the way to perpetual youth. Underground Man, 1896, by Gabriel Tarde, found favor with H.G. Wells, who provided a preface for the English edition. It describes how the last people on Earth withdraw to a utopian subterranean world when the sun's energy becomes exhausted. Fred Thorpe's short story, In the World Below, 1897, about adventures in the Hollow Earth, anticipated the famous Pellucidar series of novels by Edgar Rice Burroughs, which began with At the Earth's Core, 1914. I've read one of those. I think it was called Tanner of Pellucidar, something like that. Long time ago. Okay, we have another map, or I guess, yeah, William R. Bradshaw's map of the interior world, which was based on Sims's concept. So I'll go ahead and bring that up. Here you go. So we've got the North Pole, Siberia, 500 miles. Oh, 500 miles thick there, I guess. 1,500 miles thick here. Siberia, China, India, Australia, the South Pole, South America, Mexico, New York, North America, and I can't quite make out ice barrier. Ice barrier, okay. And inside, Plutusia. What is that? Bil Bilbamites Cirol, Bilbamitzerol, or Plutusia, Swang, Hilar, Atvadabar, Milosis, Gapthus, Egyptasis. Anyway, interesting. Not sure I quite get. Anyway, let's just move on. I could look at that for a while and contemplate on it. Okay, lost races living in a subterranean world are featured in Charles Willing Beal's Beale. Ugh. Let me start that over again. Lost races living in a subterranean world are featured in Charles Willing Beale's popular The Secret of the Earth, 1899. Nequa, or The Problem of the Ages, 1900, by Jack Adams, in which sexual equality has been achieved below ground, and Frank Powell's exceedingly rare The Wolf Men, A Tale of Amazing Adventures in the Underworld, 1906, set in prehistoric times. More recently, S. Fowler Wright has continued the tradition in his The World Below, 1953, as have Howard Waldrop and Stephen Utley in their ingenious short story Black as the Pit from Pole to Pole, 1977, which actually features Sims, Reynolds, and Poe. The Hollow Earth, 1990, by Rudy Rucker, who is professor of mathematics at San Jose State University, has drawn liberally on the entire Sims saga to describe how his protagonists accidentally stumble into one of the holes at the South Pole, as described by the captain, and there find a subterranean world full of more surprises than anyone could possibly imagine. But the true story of the search for the Hollow Earth has its own even stranger twists and turns, as we shall discover in the next chapter. And that is finally the end of that chapter. I just got ahead of myself when I had a big break there before the picture. So, I see no reason to dally. We'll just jump right into chapter 4. The Strange Voyage of Olaf Jansen. Today there is no one in Glendale, the sprawling northern suburb of Los Angeles, who is quite sure where Olaf Jansen lived, if they have heard of the remarkable old seaman at all. Years ago, there were some residents who thought that the man who claimed to have traveled into the Hollow Earth had a house close to what is now the Colorado Boulevard, while others had heard that he lived not far from the LA Zoo, which the cynics said is where he should have been confined after details of his Munchausen-like adventures were made public. In all probability, though, his modest little bungalow was not far from Foothill Boulevard in the southeast San Fernando Valley, for Jansen spoke frequently of the view from his bedroom window of the sun rising over the peaks of the San Jacinto Range to the east. Glendale is a busy residential and industrial area with its own airport, college, and 600-acre Brand Park. I wonder if it still is. This book is old enough that things may have changed a bit. Historically, its main claims to fame are Abode, Casa Adobe, an adobe building which dates from the 1860s, and the Forest Lawn Memorial Park, where many of the great and good of Los Angeles are laid to rest. The cemetery was created in 1886 on the site of the 1784 Spanish land grant and contains reproductions of a number of great works of art, including the Wee Kirk of the Heather, a facsimile of Scotland's Church of Annie Laurie. Although some reports say that Olaf Jansen is also buried in Forest Lawn, his grave has never been found. The story told by the old Scandinavian-born sailor of his voyage into the hollow earth has been the subject of considerable debate since it was first made public in 1908. Dismissed as a romantic fantasy in some quarters, accused of being a clever adaptation of the theories of John Cleves Sims and others, Olaf Jansen, then in his 90s, insisted that his narrative was true in every respect. Although reluctant to discuss the events for many years because of the initial reaction they generated and the traumatic effect this had upon his life, his testimony is one of the few accounts of a visit to the inner world that has failed to be totally dismissed amid all the welter of Sims inspired fiction. By his own admission, Jansen had never even heard of the theory of concentric spheres, let alone read anything by or about Sims, when his strange experience at the North Pole occurred. The facts about his background and that of the man who later published his story are well documented. Olaf Jansen was born on 27 October 1811 at Uleborg, now called Walu. I'm not sure how to pronounce that. Um, it is Scandinavian. Oulu, however you pronounce that. Uh, a fishing port on the eastern coast of the Gulf of Bothnia. That's Bothnia, Bothnia in Finland. His father, Jens Jansen, was Norwegian, having been born on the Lofoten Islands, while his mother came from Stockholm, where the couple had made their home. Despite the advanced stage of Mrs. Jansen's pregnancy, they had not been deterred from taking their annual cruise in Jen's boat in the Gulf. The Jansens had planned to be back in Stockholm before the birth of their first child, but stormy seas delayed the return trip and made it necessary to head for Uleborg when Mrs. Jansen went into labor. There a baby boy was delivered, and it was evident from his size and weight that the infant had inherited his father's height, sturdiness, and alert gray eyes. He would also grow up to display the same characteristics of endurance, ruggedness, and fierce determination coupled with a great gentleness. Young Olaf soon showed that he shared his father's love of the sea. After being educated in a private school in Stockholm until he was 14, the boy started to go on regular fishing trips with him around the Scandinavian coast. Jens Jansen was a man who relished the challenge of the sea but never underestimated its powers. He instructed his son in good seamanship and also filled his head with tales of the legendary Norse gods whom he greatly admired. Olaf Jansen was just 19 when he and his father set off on the voyage that was to earn them a place in the history of Hollow Earth lore. According to Olaf Jansen, they left Stockholm in his father's fishing sloop on 3 April 1829. They sailed southward between the islands of Gotland and Åland, then made their way through the Sound which separates Sweden and Denmark. After briefly stopping at Kristiansand on the Norwegian coast, they headed north past the Lofoten Islands before putting in at the most northerly port, Hammerfest. After reprovisioning, father and son sailed to the Spitzbergen, getting their first view of some towering icebergs, before anchoring safely at Wijade Bay on 23 June. Here they fished successfully for several days and then went on through the Hinlopen Strait in the direction of Franz Josef Land. Olaf Jansen takes up the story at this point. Quote, for several, day, for several days, we sailed along the rocky coast of Franz Josef Land. Finally, a favoring wind came up that enabled us to make the west coast, and after sailing for 24 hours, we came to a beautiful inlet. One could hardly believe it was the far Northland. The place was green with growing vegetation, and while the area did not comprise more than 1 or 2 acres, yet the air was warm and tranquil. In front of us and directly to the north lay an open sea. My father was an ardent believer in Odin and Thor and had frequently told me there were gods who came from far beyond the north wind. There was a tradition, he explained, that still farther northward was a land more beautiful than mortal man had ever known. My youthful imagination was fired by the ardor, zeal, and religious fervor of my good father, and I exclaimed, why not sail to this land? The sky is fair, the wind is favorable, and the sea open. Even now I can see the expression of pleasurable surprise on his countenance as he turned toward me and asked, my son, are you willing to go with me and explore, to go far beyond where man has ever ventured? I answered affirmatively. Very well, he replied. May the god Odin protect us. And quickly adjusting the sails, he glanced at our compass and turned the prow in a due northerly direction through an open channel, and our voyage began. End quote. For 3 days the fishing sloop continued to sail north until Olaf was awakened from sleep by the sounds of a fierce storm and his father calling for help in lowering the sails. All around their vessel, the young man recalled, was a vaporish fog or mist, black as Egyptian night and white like a steam cloud towards the top, which was finally lost to view as it blended with the great white flakes of falling snow. That was a quote starting out of vaporish fog. I forgot to say that. As the two seamen wrestled with the sails, the boat pitched and rolled as if in the grip of a whirlpool. This ordeal continued for 3 hours until the two drenched and exhausted sailors found themselves in calm waters. As they checked over the boat for any signs of damage, Olaf suddenly noticed a peculiar phenomenon above them. Quote, the sun was beating down slantingly as if we were in a southern latitude instead of in the far northland. It was swinging round its orbit, ever visible and rising higher and higher, frequently mist-covered, yet always peering through the lacework of clouds like some fretful eye of fate, guarding the mysterious northland. Far to our right, the rays catching the icebergs provided a pyrotechnic panorama of countless colors and shapes, while below could be seen the green-tinted sea and above the purple sky. End quote. When Olaf accidentally tasted some drops of seawater on his hand, he was amazed to discover that it was fresh water. After replenishing their supplies with this unexpected piece of good fortune, the two men sailed on for several more days. Quote, one day about this time, my father startled me by calling attention to a novel sight far in front of us, almost at the horizon. It is a mock sun, exclaimed my father. I have read of them. It is called a reflection or mirage. It will soon pass away, but this dull red false sun, as we supposed it to be, did not pass away for several hours, and while we were unconscious of its emitting any rays of light, still there was not time thereafter when we could not sweep the horizon in front and locate the illumination of the so-called false sun, during a period of at least 12 hours out of every 24. It could hardly be said to resemble the sun except in its circular shape, and when not obscured by clouds or the ocean mists. It had a hazy red, bronzed appearance, which would change to a white light like a luminous cloud, as if reflecting some greater light beyond. We finally agreed in our discussion of this smoky, furnace-colored sun that whatever the cause of the phenomena, it was not a reflection of our sun, but a planet of some sort, a reality. End quote. The boat's ooh, Excuse me. The boat's compass also indicated that something else very strange was happening. Quote, the compass, which we had tightly secured in its place for fear of another storm, was still pivoting due north and moving on its pivot, just as it had at Stockholm. The dipping of the needle had ceased. What could this mean? Our many days of sailing had certainly carried us far past the North Pole, and yet the needle continued to point north. We were sorely perplexed, for surely our direction was now south. End quote. During the next 15 days, according to Olaf Jansen's narrative, the occupants of the fishing boat saw the shorelines of several distinct land masses, some flat and others with noticeable mountain ranges. Finally, they decided to land on one. As they wandered about, they discovered a landscape of fast-flowing rivers, fine trees, and a wealth of flora much the same as they were used to, but all considerably larger. The sun again caught their attention, as Olaf recalled later. Quote, in the meantime, we had lost sight of the sun's rays, but found a radiance within, emanating from the dull red sun, which had already attracted our attention. It was now giving out a white light, seemingly from a cloud bank far away in front of us. It dispensed a greater light, I should say, than 2 full moons on the clearest night. In 12 hours this cloud of whiteness would pass out of sight as if eclipsed, and the 12 hours following corresponded with our night. My father and I commented between ourselves on the fact that the compass still pointed north, although we now knew that we had sailed over the curve or edge of the Earth's aperture and were far along southward on the inside surface of the Earth's crust, which according to my father's estimate and my own must be about 300 miles in thickness from the inside to the outside surface. Relatively speaking, it is no thicker than an eggshell, so that there is almost as much surface on the inside as on the outside of the Earth. The great luminous cloud or ball of dull red fire, which we decided to name the Smoky God, fiery red in the mornings and evenings and beautifully white at night, is seemingly suspended in the center of the great vacuum within the Earth and held to its place by the immutable law of gravitation, or a repellent atmospheric force, as the case may be. In reality, it is stationary, and the effect of night and day within is therefore produced by the Earth's daily rotation. End quote. According to Olaf Jansen, the extraordinary odyssey of the two men continued for 100 or more days that beggared description, quote unquote. At the same time, subtle changes occurred in the sea and the climate through which they were sailing. Quote, the month we reckoned to be November or December, and we sensed that the so-called South Pole was turned toward the sun. Therefore, when passing out and away from the internal light of the Smoky God and its genial warmth, we would be met by the light and warmth of the sun shining in through the south opening of the earth. We were not mistaken. End quote. Then, once again, the Jansen's boat was caught by surges of increasingly large waves as it was driven forward by the warm winds of the inner world. Gradually, they became conscious of the air growing colder and noticed a number of icebergs on the horizon. Quote, we were soon amid ice packs, and how our little craft got through the narrow channels and escaped being crushed I know not. The compass behaved in the same drunken and unreliable fashion in passing over the southern curve or edge of the Earth's shell as it had done on our inbound trip at the northern entrance. It gyrated, dipped, and seemed like a thing possessed. End quote. For days, the two seamen were forced to maneuver their little craft through the icebergs until at last open water appeared before them. But just when they appeared to be safe, the boat struck a partly submerged iceberg, and both were thrown overboard. Olaf fell unconscious onto the iceberg. When he awoke several minutes later, there was no sign of his father, and although the young man searched frantically all around the iceberg and scanned the ocean, there was no trace of Jens Jansen or the boat. Without food or any protective clothing, Olaf Jansen prepared himself to die bravely. Then suddenly a ship hove into view. Hardly daring to believe his eyes, Olaf recognized the vessel as a Scottish whaler with the name the Arlington on its side. Later he was to discover she had sailed in September from Dundee to hunt whales in the Antarctic. Waving frantically, Olaf managed to attract the attention of the boat and her crew, and half an hour later was safely on board. The captain, Angus McPherson, proved to be a kindly, dour old seafarer, but a man not given to listening to tales of what he considered pure fantasy. Quote, "When I attempted to tell him that I had come from inside the earth, the captain and mate looked at each other, shook their heads, and insisted on my being put in a bunk under the strict surveillance of the ship's doctor." End quote. Olaf Jansen recalled. After a period of rest and with several good meals inside him, he decided against speaking about his experiences anymore. Instead, he offered to work his passage home. It was to be another year before Olaf Jansen finally reached his home in Stockholm. There he learned that while he and his father had been away, his mother had died. For a second time, the young man recounted his adventure to his only surviving relative, an uncle, Gustav Osterland. Since he had been picked up in the Antarctic, he had had plenty of time to reflect on the strange journey, and now wanted to persuade his relative to finance an expedition to the inner world. Quote, "At first I thought he favored my project. He seemed interested and invited me to go before certain officials and explain to them, as I had to him, the story of our travels and discoveries. Imagine my disappointment and horror when, upon the conclusion of my narrative, certain papers were signed by my uncle, and without warning, I found myself confined in a mental institution. There I was to remain for 28 long, tedious, and frightful years." End quote. In October 1862, according to Jansen's account, he was released from the institution. His uncle had died during the intervening years, and he now found himself a man over 50, with no friends, and a record of insanity. What else was there for him to do but go back to sea? For the next 27 years he worked as a fisherman, devoting his spare time to searching for evidence that his experiences in the hollow earth had not been just a dream. He gathered together a collection of books on polar exploration, made endless notes, and drew painstaking maps. But not once during this time did he speak to another living soul about his strange voyage. In 1889, Jansen, now well into his 70s, sold his boat and decided to move to the warmer climate of America. For 12 years he lived quietly in Illinois before moving to Glendale, Los Angeles, on 4 March 1901, a date he remembered clearly as the day of President McKinley's second inauguration. There he settled unobtrusively in a little property, passing the time growing flowers and a few fig trees until the day he met Willis George Emerson. Emerson, 1856 to 1918, was a novelist and a short story writer who had moved to Los Angeles in 1907 with his wife Bonnie to work in the embryo film industry. As a popular author of westerns, he had sensed there would be a demand for his kind of material after the huge success of the Wild West movie The Great Train Robbery, released in 1903. It was a good decision because that very year of 1907, the star of The Great Train Robbery, Gilbert Anderson, created Bronco Billy, probably the first famous character figure in cinema history, in a two-reeler called The Bandit Makes Good. This was to prove the first in over 400 episodes about the cowboy hero and meant a continuous series of assignments for writers like Willis Emerson. Although Emerson and his wife lived just a couple of blocks away from Olaf Jansen, the scriptwriter only gradually became aware of the white-haired old man as he passed him on his way to and from the studios. Jansen was often to be seen in his garden, but he mostly seemed lost in thought. Emerson was to reflect later. One spring morning, however, he gave him a cheery wave, and so started a friendship that would later become a literary partnership, as Emerson wrote, quote, I soon discovered that my new acquaintance was no ordinary person, but one profound and learned to a remarkable degree, a man who, in the later years of his long life, had dug deeply into books and become strong in the power of meditative silence. I encouraged him to talk, and in the days and weeks that followed I became well acquainted with Olaf Jansen, and little by little he told me his story so marvelous that its very daring challenged reason and belief. The old man always expressed himself with so much earnestness and sincerity that I became enthralled by his strange narrations. End quote. Jansen also showed Emerson his notes and maps as he recalled every detail of his voyage into the inner world. Pressing them into the writer's hands, he said, quote, I leave them to you if I can have your promise to give them to the world. I desire that people may know the truth, for then all the mystery concerning the frozen Northland will be explained. End quote. Despite some reservations, Emerson agreed, and the result was The Smoky God, or A Voyage to the Inner World, narrated by Olaf Jansen in his own words, which Emerson delivered to his publishers, Forbes and Company in Chicago. The book was published in the spring of 1908, but sadly Olaf Jansen had died just a few weeks earlier. This time, however, he would not have to listen to any ridicule or risk being locked away. In his foreword to The Smoky God, Emerson admitted that many readers would find the story hard to believe, as he himself had done. Quote, however much the statements in this book are at variance with the cosmographical manuscripts of the past, he wrote, they may be relied upon as a record of the things Olaf Jansen claims to have seen with his own eyes. There is a saying ancient as the hills that truth is stranger than fiction, and in a most startling manner has this axiom been brought home to me while writing this book. End quote. Sorry about messing that up. Emerson also noted that his information had come to the conclusion that, as some of the old legends said, mankind had probably originated in the hollow earth, and it was there the fabled Garden of Eden had once existed. The legend of Noah and the Ark was merely a distortion of the truth, claimed Jansen. A group of men and women had countless years ago sailed out from the inner world, just as he and his father had done, to colonize the surface of the planet. Although today Olaf Jansen's place in the history of the Hollow Earth enigma is well recognized, copies of Emerson's book are very scarce indeed. An article in Fate magazine in March 1966 debating whether the old seaman's story was merely a delusion resulting from his shipwreck or a true account in every respect noted, quote, whatever the answer, it still needs to be asked, why were 2 copies of this book removed from government files? End quote. A number of Hollow Earth researchers have suggested there has been, may well still be, a conspiracy of silence among some governments about keeping secret material relating to the subterranean world. Is there reason to suspect that the Smoky God could be among these items? In the decade before his own death, Willis Emerson admitted to being skeptical about certain parts of Olaf Jansen's story. He had, however, found evidence in the writings of a number of earlier polar explorers which confirmed several of the phenomena reported by the old seaman. What he never doubted was his neighbor's sincerity. In his foreword to The Smoky God, he concluded, quote, if it was madness, then it was an eloquent madness that so appealed to my imagination that all thought of an analytical criticism was effectively dispelled. 100 times I've asked myself whether it is possible that the world's geography is incomplete and the startling narrative of Olaf Jansen is is predicated upon demonstrable facts. The reader must answer these queries to his own satisfaction. End quote. Man, we're getting there. Hopefully, my voice will hold out. I might have to go get some more water here before, in order to finish, though. Whatever controversy it may have stirred up, Olaf Janssen's narrative encouraged further examination of the Hollow Earth legend. Indeed, during that same period, around the turn of the century, several more studies of the theory were published, two of which are especially important to our story. The Phantom of the Poles by William Reed appeared in 1906 and is something of a landmark in being the first compilation of scientific evidence based on the reports of polar explorers in support of the theory that the Earth is hollow and has openings at its poles. Reed was a geography graduate of New York University who worked for a shipping line in the city. He had become interested in the whole concept after reading an article about Sim's concentric spheres. He concluded that the former soldier was on the wrong track and turned to the records of the various explorers who had visited the poles and provided accounts of their experiences, in order to try to find an alternative explanation. Among the men whose papers and books Reed studied were Sir John Franklin, 1786 to 1847, the British explorer who led two expeditions into the Arctic regions to find the Northwest Passage, the second of which, in 1845, resulted in the loss of the entire company of 129 men. He also found much of interest in the accounts of the American Elijah Kane, 1820 to 57, who went seeking the lost Franklin party and gave his name to the Kane Basin. The reports of George Wallace Melville, 1814 to 1912, a U.S. naval engineer who led the ill-fated DeLong expedition in 1879, and the papers of Adolphus Greely, 1844 to 1935, a former American Army officer who had commanded an expedition to establish a chain of meteorological stations in the Arctic. But perhaps the most important clues of all that Reed found were in the documents of the Norwegian explorer Fridtjof Nansen, 1861 to 1930, who provided so much valuable information about the Arctic environment, and Robert Peary, 1856-1920, the Pennsylvania-born explorer whose equally determined efforts to reach the North Pole were described in his book Northward, 1902. Reed went through all the information provided by these resourceful explorers with a scholar's eye before publishing his detailed 288-page book, which, like the Smoky God, is now difficult to find. In it, he declared, quote, "The earth is hollow. The poles so long sought are phantoms. There are openings at the northern and southern extremities. In the interior are vast continents, oceans, mountains, and rivers. Vegetable and animal life are evident in this new world, and it is probably peopled by races unknown to dwellers on the earth's surface." End quote. According to the facts he had sifted, William Reed felt confident in declaring that the earth is hollow is proved by the fact that no one can get to the poles. Wait a minute. This looks like a quote, sorry. So, quote, "that the earth is hollow is proved by the fact that no one can get to the poles. In recent years, all explorers have made practically the same progress for 80 to 84 degrees of latitude, and all agree that they find it warmer and with an open sea. The difference of a few degrees is owing to the longitude as well as the latitude when taking observations. The land is not necessarily the farthest north. The curve leading to the interior of the earth may be land or water, just as it happens, and he that passes to the farthest point of the circle when the observation is taken will show the farthest point north. But if he continues straight on, he will soon be losing ground or getting farther from the supposed pole, and eventually be going south and not know it, as the compass could not then be depended upon. End quote. Reed has estimated that the Earth started to curve in at 70 to 75 degrees north and south latitudes, and the poles were actually the outer rim of a magnetic circle around the polar openings. This meant that the poles, as we understood them, the term, were really in midair. It would be impossible for any explorer to claim to have reached one or other of the poles, as he would be misled by the eccentric behavior of the compass. For in neither of the north or south latitudes, the needle, for in either the north or south latitudes, the needle would point vertically down, a phenomenon which the author noted many polar explorers had experienced. Reed concluded his book with these words, quote, "I have quoted from nearly all the explorers, and their remarks prove beyond doubt that what I claim is true, that the Arctic and Antarctic oceans are bodies of open water, abounding with game of all kinds, and much warmer than farther inland. If that is true, then why have the poles not been reached? The poles are but phantoms. The earth is hollow, or in principle of reasoning, or all principle of reasoning must fail." End quote. Whew. We're almost there. We have a big illustration coming up on the next page. The second book, A Journey to the Earth's Interior, or Have the Poles Really Been Discovered, by Marshall B. Gardner, appeared 7 years later in 1913. It was published by the author himself in his hometown of Aurora in Kane County, Illinois, and like Reed's book, is hard to find today. Curiously, Gardner makes no mention of the phantom of the poles in his text or bibliography, so there is no way of knowing whether or not he had read the book. He does, however, refer to Sims and another Hollow Earth champion called the Prophet Koresh, of whom more later, in making his claim that the Earth is hollow with polar openings. Where he differed from his predecessors was in his belief that there had to be a central sun in the middle of the inner Earth. End quote. Why did I say end quote? I'm not in a quote. I don't know. There are so many quotes, and I'm getting tired. I'm sure you can tell. There was no quote there. Gardner, a factory worker in Aurora, was a dedicated student of the Hollow Earth legend. He claimed to have devoted almost a quarter of a century to writing his 456-page book, which was packed with photographs from the Arctic and Antarctic regions, as well as numerous diagrams. The most crucial of these to his theory is reproduced here. Okay, so this illustration is diagram by Marshall B. Gardner of the Hollow Earth, as published in his book, A Journey to the Earth's Interior. So let me go ahead and bring that up, share it with you. Okay, so we've got our northern and southern entrances. There's north and south poles of gravity. And I would assume that's the central sun there with the black dot. And the center of gravity in the center of the crust. All right. Finishing her up. According to Gardner, the Earth has circular openings at the poles through which the ocean waters flow. Water is able to adhere to the solid crust both above and below the hole because the center of gravity resides in the middle of this crust and not in its hollow interior. If a ship were to travel through a polar opening and reach the interior, said Gardner, it would continue to sail in a reversed position on the inside of the crust, held to it by gravity. He was also convinced that the gravitational pull around the curve from the exterior to the interior of the Earth would have a marked effect on any explorer. A 150-pound man, say, would probably weigh 300 pounds as he sailed through the polar opening, but when he reached the inside, he would weigh only 75 pounds. Gardner's explanation for this was that less gravitational force would be required to hold a body to the inside of a hollow object in rotation than to hold it to the outside. He believed that this gravitational pull would be so strong at the polar openings that halfway around the curve the salt water would mix with the fresh water from the interior, the salt water remaining a few feet below the fresh water. Like William Reed, Gardner felt that the temperatures in the inner world would be more uniform than those on the outside, that although there was plenty of rain, it was never cold enough for snow. A perfect subtropical climate, according to Gardner, and a land of paradise just waiting to be claimed by anyone bold enough to try. In his closing pages, he urged the American government to be the first to, quote, grasp this great opportunity, end quote. So certain was Marshall Gardner about his conclusions that just prior to publishing the book, he applied for a patent on his discovery to the United States Patent Office. This was filed on 25 November 1912 and granted U.S. Patent number 1096102 on 12 May 1914. The existence of this document has remained to this day a little-known secret outside the ranks of a few dedicated researchers, while at the same time being one of enormous significance if it is proven. Taking a lead from Sims, Marshall Gardner also sent copies of his book to a number of distinguished U.S. congressmen and to several heads of state in Europe. The evidence suggests that the work was acknowledged by most recipients, although very few offered any comment. One exception was Sir Arthur Conan Doyle in England, already world famous for the creation of Sherlock Holmes and becoming increasingly interested in spiritualism, who wrote to the author, quote, "I read your little book and big theory with great interest. It is so very original and actually explains so many facts that if it were not that both poles had actually been attained, I should be a convert. But I thank you none the less for a most interesting exposition." End quote. Gardner, although undoubtedly delighted to receive response, replied that the poles had actually not been attained, as Conan Doyle would find if he cared to read again that section of the book devoted to the unreliable performance of compasses when used near the poles. Several reviews in American newspapers dismissed the book as, quote, merely a rehash of the Sims theory, end quote, a charge which Gardner promptly denied as absurd because there was no similarity between his predecessor's idea of a series of concentric spheres inside the Earth and his own theory of an open environment warmed by a central sun. Quote, "It will be noticed that Sims has no coherent theory, or at least no observed facts, which will clearly show how the spaces between the verges of the concentric spheres are lighted and warmed. This is perhaps the point where the theory breaks down most disastrously. We have shown that there is more heat in the interior of the Earth than there is outside of that realm, not less, and we have shown it from observed facts. Sims depends on theory, and he is wrong." End quote. Gardner is also less than flattering about the work of a man he refers to as, quote, the mystical Koresh, end quote. He dismisses this man's theory of a radically different hollow earth as, quote, purely speculative, end quote, and does not offer his readers even a quotation from Koresh's writings or any information about where they might be found. In fact, Koresh is another key figure in this field who proposed not only that the earth was hollow, but that humans actually live inside the planet, and he conducted a series of scientific experiments to prove it. It is his story and its ramifications that we come to next. And that is the end of chapter 4. And that will be it for tonight. I am tired. That's why I started stumbling and making weird mistakes. So I will call it there. Looks like this next chapter is going to be a fairly short one. So is the next one. We might do 3 chapters this next time, because they're all pretty short. So, anyway, I am done for the night. I'm going to call it, and I will see you all in the Friday reading of those 3 chapters. Have a good night.
Feeling shattered skies, watching teary blue eyes, wonder where I might find some peace of mind. Not lights like I've had, but more sophisticated into love.